a very political question because you have an agenda. You're CNN, you're fake news. And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. No, I never discussed increasing it. I want it in perfect shape. That was just fake news by NBC. The news is fake. You are fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. It's all fake news. Fake, disgusting news.
This is a video unlike the others. The research and analysis that went into this was nothing short of frustrating and time-consuming. You see, this video isn't about Donald Trump, but actually the term he repeatedly spat at many of the media stations who reported on him unfavourably. You see, fake news isn't new at all. Prior to 2016, fake news held several other names, and some of these names have been around for decades, if not centuries. And if you've never heard of such terms as misinformation, disinformation, or subversion, I strongly suggest you stick around, because this is going to change the way you look at the world. To best visualise these aforementioned terms, I need you to think about a virus. And this particular virus was created decades ago by a government to slowly and methodically destroy its enemies from the inside. Except this is not a biological virus, it's a political one, and chances are you were already affected. You see, the impact of this virus is far-reaching, affecting not only the intended target, but also spreading to other countries and even shaping global events. So if you find yourself confused and divided with the current state of events, this may very well be the design. If you're left exhausted by the news and media, this virus could be why. And if you just don't care by what is going on around you, well, I think you best pay attention, because we are about to go down a deep rabbit hole. Let's begin.
Well, I support our democracy, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but I certainly will support the outcome of this election.
The 2016 US presidential election is not the first time the Kremlin has tried to influence the Western democratic process. In fact, this story begins much earlier. In the midst of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was locked in a struggle with the West for global dominance. The Kremlin was looking for ways to assert its influence and counteract Western propaganda efforts, and so they came up with a brilliant yet sinister plan named Operation Infection. One of the most famous examples of Operation Infection was executed in July 1983 when an article was released in an Indian newspaper that the United States had created the AIDS virus as a biological weapon. The article claimed that AIDS was created by US scientists with the intention to kill African Americans and gay people. At first, the story made little traction, and it didn't take long for the Kremlin to identify that the journalistic approach was clearly not enough. The Soviets were now seeking a more prestigious stature to their claims. Well, wind forward 2 years and that opportunity presented itself. A scientific report was published by two East German biologists. This report, named AIDS, Its Nature and Origin, outlined proof that AIDS was made in the USA. These biologists enthusiastically championed an approach, saying that the claim AIDS originated in Africa was not based on science but instead based on racism. With AIDS contraction on the rise and further propaganda being pushed by the Russians, this narrative was now spreading around the world. The Soviet plan was finally kicking into high gear. I mean, the story was even broadcasted within the US by mainstream media. The Kremlin's plan had succeeded, and the fallout from this campaign had well and truly affected the international relations between the United States and the remainder of the world. The American response was modest to say the least. A part-time group of volunteers from the government, called the Truth Squad, was assigned to expose and debunk the Soviet claims. Hardly a measure that could stop the lies, which were by then already circulating at full speed. And yet, the conspiracy theory stands. A Rand Corporation survey published in 2005 found that 27% agreed that AIDS was still produced in a government laboratory. 16% said AIDS was created to control black people. 15% agreed that AIDS is a form of genocide against African Americans. Operation Infection was much more than just a single false story. It was a massive and sustained disinformation campaign that lasted for years. The Soviet Union was relentless in its efforts to shape international perceptions. Years went by and the Soviet Union fell, but the legacy of Operation Infection lived on. To this day, many of the false stories and conspiracy theories spread by the operation continue to be cited and even believed. Okay, so why was this narrative so viral? And how was this operation so successful? Well, let's take a look at some data. Ultimately, fact-checker organisations can and have measured information diffusion, the speed of diffusion, the depth and breadth of their diffusion, and how many people have become entangled into this information cascade. Before moving on with the video, let's take a second or two to compare the spread of true news in comparison to the spread of false news. Research indicates that false news diffuses further, faster, deeper, and more broadly in every category of information studied, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And in fact, false political news was the most viral of any other category of news. We will look at why this is in another video, but I think it's time you met our three friends from earlier, and we gain a further and greater understanding of disinformation and subversion. Operation Infection serves as an excellent example of a disinformation operation, and more importantly, the geopolitical fallout that could be achieved when conducted successfully. I think now is an appropriate time we introduce three gentlemen, who many would argue are specialists in this domain. I would like to introduce you to Ladislav Bittman, Stanislav Levchenko, and Yuri Bezmenov. These three individuals worked for the KGB during the Cold War before defecting to the United States. This citizenship to the US came at a cost, and that cost was information, one of the most secretive organisations at the time. Instead of me explaining these types of operations, let's hear it straight from these ex-KGB agents.
Only about 15% of time, money and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community and their country.
Okay, so we have a basic understanding of ideological subversion or active measures, but how did the KGB define disinformation?
Disinformation is actually a deliberately distorted or manipulated information that is leaked into the communication system of the opponent with the expectation that it would be accepted as genuine information and influence either the decision-making process, for example, or to influence or manipulate public opinion.
At any given moment, the Soviets are involved in active measures all over the world and practically in any country of the world. The number of operations which they are running, we're talking about many thousands of people, probably somewhere at least 15,000 people who in the Soviet Union and outside of the Soviet Union are involved in that kind of actions on regular and daily basis.
I conclude that the Kremlin does not believe that one operation cannot and will not change the balance of power. However, the cumulative effect of these operations have the capacity to significantly affect geopolitical relations. Now, I think it's important to highlight here that the KGB nor Russia are exclusive to these types of operations. Despite increased effort by internet platforms like Facebook and Twitter to combat internet disinformation, the use of the techniques by governments around the world is growing. According to a report released in 2019 by researchers at Oxford University, governments are spreading disinformation to discredit political opponents, bury opposing views, and interfere in foreign relations. The researchers compiled information from news organisations, civil society groups, and governments to create one of the most comprehensive inventories of disinformation practices by governments around the world. They found that the number of countries with political disinformation campaigns more than doubled to 70 in the last 2 years, with evidence of at least one political party or government entity in each one of those countries engaging in social media manipulation. The shadow hanging over the 2016 US election and the Russian technological footprint involved pushed the narrative that disinformation was a foreign problem. Well, I have news for you. The majority of disinformation operations is actually domestic. Domestic information is a greater menace than foreign disinformation. While foreign information seeks to sow division and undermine public trust in democratic institutions, domestic disinformation has more far-reaching and pernicious effects on a nation's political stability and social fabric. One reason domestic disinformation is more dangerous is that it is more effective. Domestic disinformation campaigners are designed to target specific audiences and exploit their vulnerabilities, making them more difficult to counter and more likely to achieve their intended goals. This can include spreading false information about political candidates, manipulating public opinion on controversial issues, and spreading conspiracy theories that undermine trust in public institutions. Another reason domestic disinformation is a greater threat is that it is more difficult to detect and combat. Foreign disinformation campaigners are often launched from overseas, making them easy to track and counteract. Domestic disinformation, on the other hand, is often spread by individuals within the country, making it more difficult to identify and respond to. This means that domestic disinformation campaigns can continue unchecked, spreading false information and eroding public trust in democratic institutions. Ultimately, the effect of domestically driven disinformation can be devastating, often resulting in political polarisation and division, the erosion of public trust, and even in the inciting of violence. This is especially true in countries where there is a history of political instability or where the rule of law is weak. So yes, the supply of disinformation is growing, but that's in part because the demand is also growing. The ontological problem of disinformation is that it gets in the way of us seeing reality for what it is. Of course, no human being sees reality exactly the way it is. We all have our biases, but disinformation exaggerates those biases and accentuates our divide. The truth is, disinformation doesn't create divide between people, it widens them. That is the ultimate goal for disinformationists. Not so much that we believe them, but that finding the actual truth is becoming more and more difficult. The formidable active measures and disinformation apparatus that has manipulated international and domestic opinion for decades is here to stay. Digital technologies and social media has made it easier for disinformation to spread. This makes it imperative for governments, civil society organisations and individuals to be proactive in detecting, countering and preventing the spread of false information. The concern is that if these operations are being used by our own government against its own people in order to influence our opinions and actions, then who are we to trust for the truth? I would like to thank you for visiting my channel. This is part 1 of a 2-part series on active measures and disinformation. We have a lot more to cover on this highly complex and concerning subject. I would love to hear your thoughts. Are you concerned about disinformation? And do you think that these options tear at the fabrics of statehood? I'll see you all next time. Stay safe and stay informed. This is Zero Fox, out.